Welcome back to the Weekend Report. I'm Masachaba Mposwa. As South Africa grapples with its long-standing electricity crisis, price increases have become a factor, making life especially difficult for those in low-income households. Another challenge faced by municipalities is historic debt, outdated billing methods, and illegal connections. And often communities take to the streets to reject price increases and rebel by making illegal connections. Let's discuss this and more now with a sociologist at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Luke Sinwell. Good morning, Professor. Welcome to Newsroom Africa.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Firstly, Professor, can you provide some historical context about how electricity pricing has evolved in South Africa over the past decade?
Yes. So, in fact, over the last 25 years, we've seen increases in the prices of electricity at about 4 times the rate of inflation, which has meant that electricity has become increasingly unaffordable, especially for the working class in townships and informal settlements. But what I see from the wave of recent protests that have happened over the last 2 or 3 months, but especially over the last 3 weeks, in the East Rand, in Tembisa, and also in the West Rand, is that it's not just a question, although this is very important, about the prices, but also communities, the informal settlements. When you look at what's happening in the West Rand, people actually do not have access to the electricity grid. So the people living in informal settlements, you'll be familiar with an informal settlement. You wouldn't, it's not your fault that you're living there. You know, there was a mushrooming of informal settlements in the 1980s and 1990s. So a lot of people have been living in informal settlements since 1994, and then in the last 20 years as well. So for example, the people recently protesting in Laratong, but also in Chepitsong, the people living in those informal settlements are protesting because they don't have access to the grid at all, and they're connecting to electricity illegally because they have no other way of getting electricity.
Now, Professor, you've coined the term energy racism in your research, right? Can you explain how this concept helps us understand why traditional democratic channels fail working-class Black communities?
Well, that term, energy racism, is about looking at the past and the history of colonialism and apartheid to understand what is happening in the present. So historically, apartheid created a system of migrant labor that relied upon cheap working class Black labor to dig out coal and other minerals from the ground, in part to produce electricity for white areas in the suburbs. So only 40% or less than 40% of South Africans had access to electricity even by 1987. And then obviously post-1994, most of the people, although you see in informal settlements, people still don't have access, but the vast majority of communities got access to the grids, except the question of affordability now comes into play post-1994. And there's something called load reduction, whereby it is only Black working class areas, villages, townships, and informal settlements that are targeted by Eskom and cut off, either because they're unwilling or unable to pay. So in a report that we did with the Center for Sociological Research and Practice, we're calling that those cutoffs and the fact that it's predominantly or almost only Black working class areas that are cut off and targeted a continuation of apartheid mentality that prevents mainly black people from accessing electricity.
So, from a sociological perspective, Professor, what does the refusal to pay for electricity represent beyond just economic hardship?
From a sociological perspective, it is about ordinary people reclaiming, organizing, and reclaiming some kind of control over their lives. So, if it's the sociological perspective calls upon one to see through the lens of the people who don't have access to electricity, the people in Meadowlands, for example, in June, who were cut off from electricity, they were experiencing load reduction, sometimes they said for up to 15 hours per day. And then other people we were looking at in the West Rand, they don't have access to electricity at all. So when you look at the crisis through the lens of the people who are actually experiencing it, that changes one's perspective because people don't want to protest. That's the key thing. People don't want to protest. And what they say also is that they don't want to bridge the connection illegally. They want access to affordable, clean, safe energy. And when you connect illegally through those makeshift wires into an informal settlement, it's unsafe. So you wouldn't want your kids being around that. They can literally get electrocuted. But that's a last resort whereby you are choosing, like, we need to connect ourselves. We have no other way of accessing electricity. And unless we do that, we won't have power. Same thing when people go to the streets. It's a last resort. When there's an occupation of a road taking place, you can get shot at by rubber bullets, you can get arrested. So when you look at it through a sociological lens, you can see that people have few, if any, other alternatives except to engage in these forms of direct action to connect themselves and to occupy the roads so that they can basically force those in power to come to the negotiating table, or in the case of the connections, they're bypassing the system so that they can immediately access energy resources.
In your research on social movements, Professor, why do you think protests have become the primary mechanism for communities to voice their concerns about electricity pricing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the thing is that protests are a last resort. There's protests where you hand over memorandums, where you march. You'll have been a part of one of those protests. But then these kinds of protests, which are an occupation, are happening after a long period of trying to engage in the formal mechanisms of local democracy in order to have their voices heard. They'll have knocked on local government councilors' doors. They'll have sent, a lot of times, memorandums to city power or to ESCOM asking that the lights get turned on. They'll have handed over petitions. They will have waited and waited and waited. And then protests become the one that we see happening, or it can be called the smoke that calls. It calls the local authorities and the media to come and listen to the people. So we've seen protests. We see they're not necessarily the primary mechanism, but they're probably one of, if not the most effective means by which people's voices are heard in the corridors of power.
Now, with many residents surviving on 350 Rand, social relief of distress grants monthly, but a single electricity bill can exceed 400 Rand. How do you frame this as a human rights issue?
It's a long-standing human rights issue because anytime that a human being has to choose between one basic human right over another. For example, it could literally be buying a loaf of bread and turning your lights on. If once you have to choose between those, so if you only have 400 rands, or even if you have, 3,000 rands for a household, and you're spending 500 on electricity, you're not going to be left with that much left over. So it's a question of people's human rights, in effect, being violated if they cannot afford both to put their energy on and to access the basic things that they need to survive.
So, Professor, what specific policy changes would need to happen for communities to trust formal channels over protest action?
That's another really good question. So, the main thing is that although it doesn't always come across in the analysis, is that in working class communities, and the energy racism concept suggests this because it's about working class people in townships, mainly black people living in townships, indigenous people living in townships. The main thing is that they don't have access to electricity.
All right. Now, your research, Professor, shows that electricity prices have increased at 4 times the rate of inflation over 25 years. Now, from an academic perspective, what does this tell us about the sustainability of South Africa's current democratic institutions?
Yeah, well, it tells us it's not sustainable, and it tells us also that the market-oriented approach to energy distribution is what is not working. Because if the price of energy keeps going up for the poor and working class, then it means that instead of people needing to pay for electricity at the rate that the market sets it, we should actually be serving electricity through a way that gives it on the basis of people's needs rather than market-driven only forces.
Now, before I let you go, Professor, and very briefly, what are the long-term sociological implications if this pattern of protest to be heard continues?
The long-term sociological implications are that we are going to keep on seeing these waves of protests popping out, and that if the crisis over electricity, especially in working class communities, remains, that means people are continuing to experience lack of electricity. They're barely able to, as we saw in Tembisa, with a price of just increasing a tariff of 126 Rand, that had a major impact on people's ability to survive in this present context. So it means we're going to likely continue to see people stepping out and entering into the streets in order for their demands to be met by the government and ESCOM.
All right. Professor, thank you so much for your time this Sunday.
Thank you very much.